Here's a truth almost no one wants to admit in 2026. The constant urge to text someone, to swipe through another app, to fill every silent second with noise, it isn't really about connection. It's about escape. And until you understand what you're escaping from, no relationship, no algorithm, no notification will ever fix it. Most people believe the hardest part of being single is the empty side of the bed, the phone that doesn't buzz, the quiet apartment at night. But that's not what actually unsettles people. What unsettles people is what happens the moment every screen goes dark and there's nothing left to distract them from their own mind. Because the real fear was never being alone. The real fear is finally meeting yourself, and realizing there's nowhere left to hide. We live in the most distracted era in human history. There's always another video queued up, another message thread to check, another feed refreshing itself before you even asked it to. Your phone knows what you'll want to watch next before you do. None of that is inherently bad. The problem starts when constant stimulation becomes a way of avoiding reflection. Every time stillness shows up, most people reach for their phone before the silence can ask them anything. And underneath that habit, the same questions keep waiting. Is this the life I actually want? Did I choose these goals, or did I inherit them? Who am I when nobody's watching? People call this staying productive, or staying informed, and on the surface that sounds responsible. But productivity becomes avoidance the moment it leaves no room for self-examination. Even scrolling through information all day can become a way of never sitting with a single uncomfortable thought. The issue was never the activity itself. It's the motive hiding underneath it. The Stoics figured this out over 2,000 years ago, long before smartphones existed to make the avoidance easier. They believed a person had to examine their own mind with the same seriousness they'd give to any external problem. Socrates put it plainly, the unexamined life is not worth living. That kind of honesty takes courage, because it strips away the excuses people use to protect themselves. What's left is a clearer, sometimes uncomfortable view of who they actually are. Solitude removes the crowd. There's no group opinion to hide behind, no algorithm feeding you a distraction on demand. The mind becomes visible to itself, and at first that can feel unbearable. Old regrets surface. Unfinished goals start demanding attention. This is exactly the point where most people run back to noise. But every time you escape, you reinforce the belief that something inside you is too dangerous to face. Stay with it long enough, though, and something shifts. Being alone stops feeling like proof that something is missing. It becomes the space where you finally rebuild the part of yourself that got scattered across 100 open tabs and group chats. You start noticing your impulses instead of obeying them automatically. You learn that peace was never about keeping discomfort away, it was about understanding it. From an early age, almost everyone gets handed the same script. Life is supposed to move toward finding someone who completes the picture. It's in the shows you grew up watching, the songs on repeat, the casual comments from relatives at every family dinner, the couple's vacation photos filling your feed every single week. Nobody questions it, because it arrives before you even develop the habit of questioning anything. Success starts looking a certain way. Fulfillment starts looking a certain way. Even happiness starts wearing one specific face. That's how a cultural preference quietly turns into a personal expectation. And once it does, someone can build a career, hit their goals, create a life that looks good from the outside, and still feel like something is missing. Not because something actually is, but because they're measuring their life against a script they never consciously agreed to follow. Connection isn't the problem. Human connection is one of the most valuable things we have. The problem is what happens when connection becomes the only measure of whether your life is working. The moment that happens, being single stops being neutral. It becomes something to explain, something to fix, something to escape, and you start asking, am I falling behind? Instead of, does this actually align with what I value? That single shift changes everything. Decisions stop being guided by self-understanding and start being guided by the fear of missing some invisible milestone everyone else seems to have already reached. You check a dating app not because you're curious about a person, but because being unmatched for a week feels like evidence that something is wrong with you. You compare your relationship timeline to a stranger's highlight reel and quietly conclude you're behind schedule on a race nobody actually asked you to run. And this is exactly where the search for validation takes root. A compliment starts to feel like proof you matter. A like, a comment, a bit of attention, it all starts to feel like evidence of your own worth. None of that is inherently bad. It becomes a problem the moment it turns from a bonus into a requirement. As Epictetus put it, if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. But most people build their entire sense of self on something that shifts every single day: other people's opinions. This is especially dangerous in relationships, because relationships offer instant emotional feedback. Reassurance, recognition, a feeling of importance, it's immediate. But when your identity is built on that feedback loop, you quietly stop asking, "What do I actually think?" and start asking, "What will keep this person happy with me?" The compromises feel small and reasonable at first. Over time, they reshape who you believe yourself to be. The desire to belong slowly turns into the habit of conforming. The Stoics drew a hard line here. Your reputation doesn't belong to you. Other people's approval doesn't belong to you. Their opinions don't belong to you. What belongs to you is your character, your judgment, your choices. Once you actually build your identity from that internal foundation instead of external applause, the entire relationship between you and the world around you changes. At first, adapting to other people feels responsible. Cooperation matters. Considering other people's needs matters. But there's a line between adapting and erasing yourself, between compromise and quiet surrender, and that line gets blurry the moment approval starts to feel more important than honesty. You start filtering your own opinions before you say them out loud. You avoid goals that might create friction. You ignore instincts that once felt completely clear, just to avoid disappointing someone. Marcus Aurelius warned about exactly this. Never value anything so highly that it forces you to break your word or abandon your self-respect. Most people try to fix that restless, empty feeling by changing something external: a new job, a new city, a new relationship, a new app that promises a better match this time. Sometimes those things genuinely help. But often the real issue isn't circumstantial at all. It's that years of adapting to everyone else's expectations have made it hard to even hear your own voice anymore. When it does speak up, it usually doesn't arrive as clarity. It arrives as restlessness, a vague sense that something's missing, without telling you exactly what. The Stoics protected inner freedom fiercely because they knew exactly how easily it gets handed away: to status, to fear, to public opinion, to relationships, to a number on a screen. Real freedom isn't the absence of connection. It's the absence of dependence. You stay free the moment your principles matter more to you than anyone's approval, the moment you can sit with temporary discomfort instead of betraying what you actually know to be true. That kind of freedom rarely gets tested during a crisis. It gets tested on an ordinary Tuesday, when honesty is inconvenient, when staying quiet would be so much easier, when chasing something meaningful means disappointing someone's expectations. Every one of those small moments teaches your mind what to value. Keep abandoning your own judgment, and you become more dependent on everyone else's. Keep honoring it, and you build a stability that's almost impossible to shake. If any of this feels familiar, moments where you traded your instincts for approval, goals you shelved out of fear of criticism, that's not a reason for guilt. It's a reason for awareness. The moment a pattern becomes visible, it starts losing its grip on you. There's another layer to this that most people never stop to examine. Somewhere along the way, being busy became a badge of honor. Calendars filled with back-to-back meetings, weekends packed with plans, a phone that never stops buzzing, all of it gets worn like proof of a life well lived. But ask yourself honestly, how much of that busyness is actual purpose? And how much of it is a well-disguised way of never being still long enough to hear an uncomfortable question? Modern life has become remarkably efficient at answering that question for you before you even ask it. The moment a quiet gap opens up in your day, something is already there to fill it. A recommendation algorithm has already decided what you should watch next. A group chat is already waiting for a reply. An inbox is already refreshing itself with something that feels urgent but rarely is. None of these things force themselves on you. You reach for them, again and again, because reaching for them is easier than sitting with whatever silence would otherwise reveal. The Stoics didn't have smartphones, but they understood the mechanism perfectly. Seneca wrote about people who complain that life is short while wasting enormous amounts of it on things that don't matter. He wasn't scolding people for resting or enjoying themselves. He was pointing at something more specific: the habit of filling time to avoid facing yourself, mistaking motion for meaning. 2,000 years later, the tools have changed. The pattern hasn't. Consider how differently a single unstructured hour feels depending on your relationship with yourself. For someone who has spent years avoiding their own thoughts, an empty hour can feel like standing at the edge of something frightening. For someone who has done the work of sitting with themselves, that same hour feels like a gift, space to think, to plan, to simply exist without needing anything to happen. The hour hasn't changed. The person holding it has. This is why so many people describe an almost immediate anxiety the moment their phone runs out of battery, or their internet goes down, or a flight forces them offline for a few hours. It isn't really about missing information. It's about missing the escape hatch. When the usual exits are closed, whatever has been avoided finally has room to surface, and for a mind that isn't used to sitting with itself, that can feel unbearable. But here's what almost nobody tells you: that discomfort is not a malfunction. It's a signal. It's the same signal the Stoics were pointing to when they talked about examining your own mind daily. It's not there to punish you. It's there to show you exactly where your attention has been avoiding going. Marcus Aurelius, arguably the most powerful man in the world at the time, still made space every single day to sit with his own thoughts, to question his motives, to hold himself accountable to his own principles rather than the opinions of the empire around him. If a Roman emperor with the weight of the known world on his shoulders considered this non-negotiable, it's worth asking why the average person today, holding a device with more processing power than his entire empire combined, considers 5 uninterrupted minutes of thought a burden. Part of the answer is that we've been sold a very convincing story: that stimulation equals happiness, that connection equals worth, that a full calendar equals a full life. It's a story that benefits everyone except the person living it. Every app, every platform, every feed is built by people who understand human psychology extremely well, and their business model depends on you never quite feeling finished, never quite feeling satisfied, always reaching for one more scroll, one more match, one more validation. Understanding that doesn't mean throwing your phone in a river or moving to a cabin in the woods. It means recognizing the mechanism for what it is, so it stops operating on you without your permission. The goal was never to eliminate connection or distraction entirely. The goal is to notice when you're reaching for them out of genuine desire versus reaching for them because sitting still has become unbearable. This distinction changes the way you experience being single almost overnight. Instead of treating every quiet evening as a problem to be solved by finding someone to talk to, you start treating it as territory to explore. What do you actually enjoy, when no one is watching and there's no one to perform for? What thoughts arise when the noise finally clears? What have you been avoiding that's actually not that frightening once you look at it directly? The Stoics called this kind of practice an examination of the self, and they treated it the way an athlete treats training: not glamorous, not always comfortable, but essential if you want to become stronger. Nobody becomes resilient by avoiding every uncomfortable rep. The same is true for the mind. You don't build a stable inner life by avoiding every quiet, uncomfortable moment. You build it by staying in the room a little longer each time, until the room stops feeling threatening. There's also a quieter kind of pressure worth naming directly: the pressure that comes from watching everyone else's life through a screen. Every feed is a highlight reel, edited and curated, showing engagement announcements, anniversary posts, couples on vacation, milestones stacked one after another. What rarely gets shown is the argument before the photo was taken, the years of doubt before the relationship stabilized, the quiet insecurity that person might be carrying behind the caption. Comparing your unfiltered, ordinary Tuesday to someone else's carefully selected highlight is not a fair comparison, and yet the mind does it constantly, almost automatically, because that's exactly what these platforms are engineered to make you do. The Stoics never had to deal with a curated feed, but they understood the underlying trap with remarkable precision. Epictetus taught that suffering comes not from events themselves but from our judgments about those events. Seeing a friend's engagement post is a neutral event. The suffering appears the moment your mind attaches a judgment to it. The story that says you're behind, that something is wrong with your timeline, that everyone else has figured out something you haven't. Remove the judgment, and the same photo becomes nothing more than information about someone else's life, carrying no verdict about yours. This is easier to say than to practice, because comparison is one of the oldest, most automatic habits the human mind runs. But awareness changes the equation. The moment you notice yourself measuring your life against a curated fragment of someone else's, you can pause and ask a simple question: am I actually unhappy with my life? Or am I unhappy with how it compares to an edited version of someone else's? 9 times out of 10, it's the second one, and naming that difference quietly deflates the entire feeling. There's a reason so many people report feeling worse after opening a social app, even when nothing bad actually happened during that scroll. It's not that the content itself is harmful. It's that 30 minutes of comparison, absorbed passively, without any conscious examination, quietly convinces the mind that it's falling behind in a race it never agreed to enter. Multiply that by every single day, and it starts to explain why so many people feel a low-grade dissatisfaction they can't quite name, despite objectively good lives. Breaking that cycle doesn't require quitting every platform. It requires becoming the kind of person who can look at any input, a photo, a comment, a headline, and consciously choose what judgment, if any, to attach to it. That's a skill, and like any skill, it's built through repetition, not willpower alone. Every time you catch the comparison forming and choose not to follow it, the habit weakens a little. Every time you follow it automatically, the habit strengthens. There is no neutral option. You are always training the pattern one way or the other. This same principle extends directly into how people treat their own single status. Somewhere along the way, a relationship became treated less like a genuine connection between two people and more like a checkbox, a milestone to unlock before you're allowed to feel like your life is on track. Under that framing, singleness stops being a neutral circumstance and becomes something closer to a deficiency, a problem waiting for the right person to solve it. But flip that framing and something interesting happens. What if a relationship was never meant to be the fix for an incomplete person, but rather the shared experience of two people who were each already whole? Under that lens, being single isn't a waiting room. It's the actual work, the years spent figuring out who you are outside of anyone else's validation, so that whenever a relationship does happen, it's built on stability instead of need. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself that very little is needed to make a happy life, because it's all within yourself, in your way of thinking. He wasn't dismissing relationships or connection. He was pointing at where the real foundation has to be built first. A house built on someone else's foundation collapses the moment that person leaves. A house built on your own foundation stays standing no matter who comes or goes. None of this means suppressing the desire for connection or pretending you don't want a relationship if you genuinely do. Wanting connection is human and healthy. The distinction the Stoics were drawing is between wanting something and needing it to feel whole. Want leaves room for patience, for standards, for walking away from something that doesn't align with your values. Need collapses all of that, because need will accept almost anything rather than face the discomfort of going without. This is where a lot of people quietly get stuck without realizing it. They tell themselves they're simply looking for the right person, when what's actually happening is that any attention at all starts to feel necessary, simply because being alone with their own thoughts has become unbearable. That's not a relationship built on choice. That's dependence wearing the costume of romance, and it rarely ends well, because the moment the initial validation fades, as it eventually does in every relationship, the same emptiness resurfaces, except now there's another person tangled up in it too. Untangling this doesn't happen by finding the right partner. It happens by doing the quieter, less glamorous work of becoming someone who is genuinely fine on their own, not in a performative way, but in a real, tested, lived-in way. That's not built through a single realization. It's built through repetition, the same way physical strength is built, one uncomfortable rep at a time, one quiet evening at a time, one moment of choosing presence over distraction at a time. There's one more piece of this worth sitting with before moving forward. Somewhere in the process of chasing constant stimulation and constant validation, people quietly lose touch with something simple: the ability to enjoy their own company without needing to justify it. Ask a young child to sit alone in a room with nothing but their own imagination, and they'll invent an entire world in minutes. Ask most adults to do the same thing, and within 90 seconds the hand is already reaching for a phone. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, solitude stopped being a playground and started being treated like a problem. Reclaiming that isn't complicated, but it is uncomfortable at first, the way any long-neglected skill feels stiff before it feels natural again. It starts with small, deliberate choices: eating a meal without a screen in front of you, taking a walk without anything playing in your ears, sitting with a single thought for longer than it takes to reach for a distraction. None of these moments look impressive from the outside. Nobody is going to notice you doing them. But they are exactly the repetitions that rebuild the muscle the algorithm has spent years quietly weakening. The Stoics would have recognized this instantly, because their entire practice was built on small, unremarkable, daily repetitions rather than dramatic transformations. Marcus Aurelius didn't become the person history remembers through one profound insight. He became that person through years of writing the same kinds of reminders to himself, over and over, in a private journal never meant to be read by anyone else. The consistency was the practice. The insight was simply what consistency eventually produced. That's worth remembering the next time an evening alone feels heavier than expected, or a weekend without plans starts to feel like evidence that something is wrong. It isn't evidence of anything except an opportunity. The same opportunity available to anyone willing to sit in the discomfort a little longer than the habit of avoidance wants them to. Nothing about that discomfort is permanent. It softens every single time you choose to stay instead of reaching for the exit. None of this happens on a strict timeline, and there's no finish line where a person officially becomes healed or complete. It's an ongoing practice, closer to maintaining physical fitness than achieving a diploma. Some weeks the pull toward distraction will feel stronger. Some evenings the old urge to fill every silence will win. That's not failure. That's simply the nature of undoing years of conditioning one repetition at a time. What matters is not perfect consistency, but the willingness to keep returning to the practice after every slip, without treating the slip itself as proof that the work isn't working. That's what this next part of the journey is about, not becoming someone who no longer needs anyone, but becoming someone whose peace no longer depends on being needed. If any of what you've just heard is starting to reframe how you see your own solitude, stay with me, because the next part goes even deeper into exactly how that shift happens, and what it actually looks like once it does. There's a point where running from yourself becomes more exhausting than just sitting still. Most people hit that point without even realizing it, endlessly chasing the next distraction, convinced it'll finally bring relief, and it never quite does. This is where solitude gets completely misunderstood. Most people treat it like something to avoid, something tied to loneliness or absence. But being alone and feeling abandoned are not the same thing. One is a physical fact. The other is just an interpretation your mind is running. You can feel completely lonely in a room full of people, or completely at peace sitting by yourself. The difference has almost nothing to do with who's around you and everything to do with your relationship with yourself. The hard part is that silence reveals things noise conveniently buries. Old regrets resurface. Unresolved situations reappear. Questions you've been avoiding for years suddenly feel close. Most people mistake that discomfort as proof that solitude is bad for them, when it's actually proof that something important is finally surfacing. Picture a room that's been shut for years. Dust everywhere, things scattered, nothing organized. Your instinct is to shut the door and walk away. But the room doesn't get better by being ignored. It gets better because someone's finally willing to stay long enough to deal with it. Your inner world works exactly the same way. Avoidance only delays the clarity. Observation is what actually creates change. The Stoics built their entire practice around this. They examined their own thoughts and motives constantly, not as self-punishment, but as honesty. They understood that whatever feels threatening from a distance usually becomes manageable the second you actually look at it directly. Most fear comes from uncertainty, not from reality itself. Stay with that reflection long enough, and solitude starts to change shape. What looked like a punishment starts looking like a mirror. And a mirror doesn't invent anything new, it just shows you what was already there. That exposure can feel uncomfortable, but it's useful, because nothing gets fixed until it's actually seen. Something else starts happening too, your mind gets less reactive. Thoughts still show up, but they stop running the show automatically. Emotions still arise, but they stop dictating every decision. There's more space between what you feel and what you do, and that gap is where deliberate choices live instead of automatic ones. This shift is never dramatic. There's no single lightning bolt moment. It's quiet. You just notice one day that you don't need constant distraction anymore. You trust your own judgment instead of checking in with everyone else first. Moments of solitude that used to feel unbearable start feeling restorative. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you'll find strength." There comes a point where you realize independence was never about living alone or proving you don't need anyone. It's the ability to stay steady no matter who walks in or out of your life. A lot of people think they're independent because they pay their own bills and make their own decisions, yet their entire emotional state still rises and falls based on other people's reactions. A compliment lifts them too high. A rejection cuts too deep. This is exactly why staying single, even temporarily, can become one of the most valuable growth periods of your life. It removes every place dependence likes to hide. Without someone constantly supplying reassurance, you start noticing exactly how much you've been relying on that reassurance. That awareness is uncomfortable at first, but it's not a sign something's wrong. It's a sign something hidden is finally coming into view. Most people get incredibly skilled at handling external problems, deadlines, responsibilities, obligations, while completely neglecting their relationship with their own emotions. Loneliness shows up, and they immediately look for the exit. Uncertainty appears, and they go searching for reassurance. Self-doubt creeps in, and they look for someone else to talk them out of it. As Seneca observed, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. Solitude interrupts that entire cycle. You start learning that discomfort doesn't require an immediate reaction. That anxiety doesn't have to control your choices. That loneliness doesn't automatically become despair. This isn't about becoming cold or shutting people out. It's about understanding one simple fact: your emotional foundation is yours to carry. Other people can add to your life, support you, share incredible moments with you, but they were never built to be responsible for your inner balance. The moment you fully accept that, relationships stop feeling like lifelines and start feeling like choices. And that changes everything. The Stoics kept coming back to one idea: real freedom is rarely lost all at once. It gets surrendered slowly, to possessions, to status, to public opinion, to relationships. But the more ownership you take of your own mind, the stronger your stability becomes, regardless of what's happening around you. Eventually the realization hits: being single was never the actual goal. Staying alone forever was never the point. The point was becoming whole, building enough self-understanding that your life stops revolving around escaping yourself. Once that clicks, solitude stops being frightening. Relationships stop being a requirement and start being a genuine addition. And love, when it eventually shows up, becomes a choice made from strength, not a rescue mission made from fear. As Carl Jung put it, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The moment you know you can stand on your own, connection becomes cleaner, more honest, less desperate. You stop entering relationships hoping to be completed and start entering them already whole, bringing your own stability into something shared instead of asking someone else to hold it for you. The world in 2026 will keep telling you fulfillment is one scroll, one match, one notification away. But the strongest foundation you'll ever build is the one that exists the moment you stop running from yourself and start standing firmly in your own company. That's when you stop searching for someone to complete your life and realize you already built one worth living. There's a practical dimension to all of this that rarely gets discussed, and it deserves attention here. Emotional self-sufficiency isn't a mystical state you either have or don't have. It's built through specific, repeatable habits, the same way physical strength is built through specific, repeatable training. The first habit is learning to notice the urge to reach for distraction the instant it appears, rather than acting on it automatically. That single pause, noticing before reacting, is where almost all meaningful change begins. The second habit is learning to sit with an uncomfortable feeling long enough to understand what it's actually about, instead of immediately trying to make it disappear. Boredom, restlessness, a vague sense of missing out, these feelings are rarely as complicated as they seem once you actually stop to examine them. Most of the time, they're pointing at something specific, an unmet need for purpose, a decision you've been avoiding, a value you've quietly stopped honoring. The feeling itself is just a messenger. Chasing it away without reading the message means you'll keep receiving the same message in a slightly different form, over and over, until it finally gets addressed. The third habit is learning to separate what is actually within your control from what isn't. This was one of the Stoics' central teachings, and it remains one of the most practically useful ideas in existence. You cannot control whether someone replies to a message, whether a relationship works out, whether other people approve of your choices. You can control your effort, your honesty, your response, your character. The moment you stop pouring energy into the first category and start investing it entirely in the second, an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering simply disappears, not because the external world became easier, but because you stopped trying to manage things that were never yours to manage in the first place. None of these habits require isolation. In fact, the point is almost the opposite. A person who has genuinely built this kind of internal stability tends to show up better in every relationship they're part of, friendships, family, romantic connections. They listen without needing to be right. They can hear disagreement without feeling threatened by it. They can be present with another person without secretly needing that person to fix something inside them. Paradoxically, becoming less dependent on others for your peace tends to make you a far better companion to the people already in your life. This also reshapes what dating and relationships actually look like once they do happen. Someone operating from genuine self-sufficiency doesn't scan every new connection for signs of rescue. They're not measuring a date against the checklist of, "Will this finally make me feel complete?" They're simply asking whether this is a person whose company adds real value to a life that's already, on its own terms, worth living. That's an entirely different filter than the one most people are unconsciously running, and it tends to produce entirely different outcomes. Relationships built on genuine compatibility rather than mutual need. It's worth being honest about something else too. This shift doesn't happen because you decided it should, in one sitting, after watching a single video. It happens through accumulated evidence. Every time you sit through a lonely evening without spiraling, you gather a small piece of proof that you can handle it. Every time you make a decision based on your own values instead of someone else's expectations, you gather more proof. Over months, these small pieces of evidence stack into something the Stoics would recognize instantly, a settled confidence that isn't loud, isn't performative, and doesn't need anyone's permission to exist. There's also a specific kind of clarity that becomes available once the constant noise of validation-seeking quiets down. Decisions that used to feel complicated, which career path to pursue, which friendships to keep investing in, which habits to build or break, start to feel more obvious, not because the decisions themselves changed, but because the mind making them is no longer clouded by the question of how each choice will be perceived by everyone else. Clarity was never missing. It was buried under layers of other people's opinions. If you trace this all the way back to where it started, the pattern is simple to describe even though it takes real effort to unwind. Distraction numbs discomfort instead of resolving it. Validation soothes insecurity instead of healing it. Constant connection fills silence instead of understanding what the silence was trying to say. Every one of these substitutes offers temporary relief, while quietly reinforcing the exact dependency it was supposed to solve. The way out was never adding more of any of these things. It was learning to stay present with yourself long enough that you stop needing them as often. That doesn't mean discipline replaces joy, or that solitude is somehow superior to connection. It means solitude stops being the enemy and starts being the training ground where the version of you capable of real, healthy connection actually gets built. Nobody arrives at genuine intimacy by skipping the step of first learning to be whole on their own. Skipping that step doesn't make relationships easier. It just moves the same unresolved dependency into a shared space with another person, where it usually causes far more damage than it would have caused alone. As this understanding deepens, something shifts in how a person relates to time itself. An empty weekend stops being something to fill and starts being something to use. A quiet evening stops being evidence of failure and starts being an opportunity most people never give themselves. The years spent single stop feeling like a waiting room before real life begins, because real life was already happening the entire time. It just took learning to sit still long enough to notice it. It helps to look at this through a concrete lens rather than an abstract one. Picture two people, both single, both roughly the same age, both facing an ordinary Friday night with no plans. The first person feels the silence creeping in almost immediately. Within minutes, the phone is out, an app is open, a message is sent to anyone who might respond, just to fill the space. If nobody replies quickly enough, a familiar anxiety builds, the sense that something is wrong, that this night alone is proof of some deficiency. By the end of the evening, exhausted from the search for distraction, that person feels worse than when the night began, even though nothing bad actually happened. The second person feels the same initial quiet. The instinct to reach for a phone is there too. It doesn't disappear just because someone has done the work. But instead of acting on it automatically, there's a pause. A recognition: this is just an evening, and an evening alone isn't a verdict on my worth. Maybe they cook something they've been meaning to try. Maybe they read, or walk, or simply sit with their own thoughts for a while. By the end of the night, that person feels rested, even recharged, because the evening was spent rather than survived. Nothing about their circumstances was different. Same city, same apps installed on the same kind of phone, same absence of plans. The only difference was the relationship each person had with their own solitude, one treating it as a problem to escape, the other treating it as time that belonged to them. That difference is not a personality trait some people are born with and others aren't. It's a skill, built through repetition, available to anyone willing to practice it. This is exactly the kind of distinction the Stoics spent their entire philosophy trying to teach. Epictetus made a simple but powerful observation: it's not events that disturb people, but their judgments about events. An empty Friday night is an event. Whether it feels like loneliness or like peace depends entirely on the judgment attached to it, and that judgment, unlike the event itself, is something you actually have influence over. Building that influence starts small. It might begin with noticing, without judgment, how often the instinct to reach for a distraction shows up during a single day. Not fighting it, not shaming yourself for it, just noticing. Awareness alone starts to create a small gap between the impulse and the action, and that gap is where all meaningful change actually happens. Over time, that gap widens, and what used to be an automatic reflex becomes an actual choice. Another practical piece of this involves how a person talks to themselves during moments of solitude. Internal language matters far more than most people realize. Someone who thinks, "I'm alone again, something is wrong with me," is training their mind toward one interpretation of solitude. Someone who thinks, "I have time to myself, what do I want to do with it?" is training their mind toward a completely different one. The circumstance is identical. The internal narration is what determines whether that circumstance feels like punishment or possibility. This isn't about forcing positivity or pretending discomfort doesn't exist. Some evenings alone genuinely are hard, especially after a loss, a breakup, or a difficult stretch of life. The Stoics never claimed that hardship should be denied or suppressed. They simply insisted that even in hardship, the interpretation you bring to the experience shapes how much it costs you. Grief examined honestly moves through a person. Grief avoided through constant distraction tends to linger far longer, quietly shaping decisions from somewhere beneath conscious awareness. There's also something worth saying about the specific role technology plays in all of this, because pretending it isn't a factor would be dishonest. Every platform competing for your attention in 2026 is designed by extremely capable people whose primary metric of success is how much of your time and attention they can capture. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's simply the business model. Recommendation systems are tuned to keep you scrolling. Notification timing is engineered to interrupt you at the moments you're most likely to respond. None of this is inherently evil, but none of it is neutral either, and pretending your habits around these tools are purely a matter of personal willpower ignores how much engineering is working against that willpower every single day. Knowing this doesn't mean withdrawing from the modern world entirely. It means approaching these tools the way the Stoics approached every external influence, as something to engage with deliberately rather than something to be swept along by. You can use a platform without letting a platform use you. The difference lies entirely in whether you're making a conscious choice to open the app, or whether the app is making the choice for you through habit, boredom, or an unexamined itch for stimulation. One useful practice, borrowed loosely from Stoic tradition, is a nightly review, a few honest minutes at the end of each day spent asking simple questions. Where did I act from my own values today, and where did I act from fear of what others would think? Where did I reach for distraction instead of sitting with something that needed my attention? What actually went well today, independent of anyone else's response to it? Marcus Aurelius returned to variations of these questions constantly in his private writing, not because he had all the answers, but because the practice of asking mattered more than any single answer ever could. Over weeks and months, this kind of consistent reflection starts to reveal patterns a person could never see clearly while caught inside them. Maybe every instance of reaching for a phone in panic traces back to a specific kind of thought, a comparison, a fear of missing out, a worry about being forgotten. Maybe every difficult evening alone follows a specific kind of day, one where a boundary wasn't honored or a value was quietly compromised. These patterns are invisible without reflection and increasingly obvious once you start looking for them. Seeing the pattern is not the same as immediately fixing it, and that's an important distinction to hold on to. Old habits don't disappear the moment they're identified. They loosen gradually, the way a knot loosens under patient, repeated pressure rather than one forceful pull. Expecting instant transformation after a single insight sets most people up for disappointment, and ironically, drives them right back toward the distractions they were trying to move away from. Patience with the process is not optional. It's the process. What eventually emerges from all of this isn't the absence of loneliness, desire for connection, or occasional difficult nights. Those remain part of being human, regardless of how much internal work someone has done. What changes is the relationship to those experiences. They stop feeling like emergencies requiring an immediate escape and start feeling like weather passing through, real, sometimes uncomfortable, but never permanent, and never proof that something has gone fundamentally wrong. That shift, more than any single insight or quote or piece of advice, is what the Stoics were actually pointing toward across everything they wrote. Not the elimination of difficulty, but the development of a mind sturdy enough to meet difficulty without being knocked over by it. Applied to something as ordinary as being single in 2026, surrounded by apps and algorithms built to make you feel behind, that sturdiness becomes one of the most valuable things a person can build, not because it guarantees a relationship will appear, but because it guarantees that whether one appears or not, the life being lived in the meantime is genuinely, honestly, your own. It's worth addressing one more misconception directly, because it tends to undo a lot of the progress people make once they hear it repeated enough times online. The idea that becoming emotionally self-sufficient means you'll eventually stop wanting a relationship altogether, or that wanting one somehow contradicts everything discussed here. That's not what any of this points to. Wanting connection, wanting to share your life with someone, wanting a partner to build a future alongside, none of that disappears through inner work, and none of it should. The Stoics were never advocating for a life devoid of relationships. Many of them had families, friendships, deep partnerships. What they rejected was the idea that a person's peace should be hostage to those relationships existing or not. There's a meaningful difference between a life that includes a relationship and a life that depends on one to feel valid. The first person can be present in a relationship without gripping it out of fear. The second person often can't fully enjoy a relationship even while inside it, because some part of them is always monitoring for signs it might end, always half-braced for the return of the emptiness a partner was supposed to permanently solve. Ironically, that constant monitoring tends to strain relationships far more than genuine independence ever would. This is worth sitting with for anyone currently single and feeling pressure, from family, from friends, from a culture that treats relationship status as a scoreboard, to find someone quickly, as though time itself were working against them. Rushing into connection from a place of unresolved dependency rarely produces the outcome people are hoping for. It tends to produce relationships built on relief rather than genuine compatibility, relief that fades the moment the initial excitement does, leaving the same unresolved emptiness sitting underneath, except now shared with another person who didn't sign up to carry it. None of this is an argument for waiting indefinitely or treating relationships as something to be earned only after achieving some perfect state of inner peace. Nobody reaches perfect peace, and waiting for that as a prerequisite for connection would mean waiting forever. The point is simpler than that. It's about noticing the difference between reaching towards someone because you genuinely want to share your life, and reaching towards someone because you can't tolerate another quiet evening with your own thoughts. The first is connection. The second is an escape wearing connection's clothing, and the two feel similar in the moment but tend to produce very different outcomes over time. There's a kind of quiet dignity in choosing to do the slower, less immediately rewarding work of building that internal stability first. It doesn't photograph well. Nobody posts about the evening they spent sitting with an uncomfortable feeling instead of numbing it. Nobody announces the small moment of choosing their own values over someone else's approval. This work is almost entirely invisible to everyone except the person doing it, and that's exactly why so few people commit to it. It offers no external reward, no likes, no immediate validation, only the compounding, private benefit of becoming someone who is genuinely, verifiably okay, regardless of what life brings next. That benefit, though invisible to everyone else, tends to become the most visible thing about a person over time. It shows up in how they handle disappointment. It shows up in how they speak about themselves when things go wrong. It shows up in the quality of the relationships they eventually build, because those relationships are no longer being asked to solve a problem they were never designed to solve. Every part of this journey, examined honestly, points toward the same simple destination, a life that doesn't need rescuing, entered into by choice, lived on its own honest terms. If this shifted something in you, there's another video on your screen right now that goes even deeper into this exact mindset. Tap it, and keep building.